It was a Friday like any other in Cedarwood Heights, a small town where nothing much happened. Emily Thompson, an 18-year-old girl, unexpectedly found herself with the house to herself for the entire weekend. Her parents had decided to leave last minute for a conference in the countryside, leaving her alone in a large old house, located in a remote area of the town. "Be responsible," were her mother's last words as the car drove down the long gravel road. Emily promised she would, but as soon as the dust from the car disappeared, something different crossed her mind. A party. What could go wrong? Emily had always been responsible, a good student, never involved in any trouble. So, why not? She sent a few messages to her group of friends, and in less than an hour, the word that the Thompson house was open for a party spread. By 9 p.m., the house was full. Beer bottles, loud music, and laughter filled the hallways. Emily, however, felt uncomfortable. She expected something small, intimate, but this? It was out of control. Teenagers she had never seen before roamed her house, and the atmosphere, once fun, began to feel heavy. In the back of Emily's mind, a sense that something was wrong slowly grew, like a dark shadow approaching. But drowned in the laughter and sounds of the party, she ignored the feeling. Maybe it was just the anxiety of being caught. But it wasn't that. At 10:30 p.m., the first strange thing happened. Ryan, her best friend, was nowhere to be found. She had spoken to him just 15 minutes earlier, but suddenly, he had disappeared. She asked a few friends if they had seen him, but no one knew anything. "He must have left without telling me," she thought, trying to convince herself. But then, a piercing scream echoed through the house. Everyone froze, the sound of the music muffled, as if the house itself held its breath. The scream came from upstairs. Emily ran, followed by a few close friends. They reached the hallway bathroom, and when they opened the door, they found Heather, one of Emily's friends, trembling with fear, pointing at the bathtub. Inside the tub, covered in blood, was Ryan. His body was twisted in a strange way, as if he had been thrown there, dead for just a few minutes. The water, tinged red, slowly dripped down the drain. Panic spread like wildfire. Someone tried calling the police, but their phones had no signal. Emily, still in shock, began to notice that the atmosphere in the house had changed. The music was turned off, laughter had turned to whispers of fear, and one by one, the lights started flickering. The friends ran to the front door, trying to escape, but it was locked. And the windows were locked too. This didn't make sense, Emily thought. She had left some of them open because of the heat. Someone suggested grabbing the keys from the kitchen, but when they got there, they found another body. Trevor, one of the guys Emily barely knew, was lying face down on the floor, with a knife plunged into his back. His blood stained the white tiles of the kitchen, creating a terrifying contrast. That's when everyone realized there was a killer inside the house, and they were trapped with them. Emily took control of the situation. She made everyone stay together in the main living room. She counted the people. Only 7 remained. Fear was etched on every face. Sarah, one of Emily's closest friends, was panicking. Why won't the door open? How is this happening? They locked us in here, Emily replied, her voice trembling. But who did this? A noise from the basement interrupted the conversation. It was a metallic sound, like something or someone was dragging chains. Emily's stomach turned. No one wanted to investigate, but they knew they couldn't just stand there. Mark, the bravest of the group, decided to go down and check. He took a baseball bat he found in the living room closet. The group followed him at a safe distance. The Thompson house basement was old, poorly lit, with concrete walls that seemed to absorb sound rather than reflect it. As they descended the stairs, the air grew heavier, denser. Mark opened the basement door, and the sight that awaited them was more macabre than they could have imagined. Chains hung from the ceiling, some with sharp hooks at the ends. In the corner, a thin, hooded figure stood with its back to them, moving in a strange way, as if performing some kind of ritual. "Who are you?" Mark shouted, his voice cracking with nerves. The figure stopped, slowly turning around. When the hood fell, everyone gasped. The face was pale, almost lifeless, the eyes sunken into dark sockets. It was someone they knew, one of the guests, but he looked different, as if something had possessed him. Before they could react, he charged toward the group with inhuman speed. Mark tried to hit him with the bat, but the blow was deflected with brutal force. The killer knocked him to the ground, and within seconds, Mark's body lay still, his neck twisted at an impossible angle. Chaos erupted once again. Screams echoed through the basement as everyone ran to escape. Emily led the group back to the main floor, trying to process what had just happened. The house now felt like a maze. Doors that used to lead to familiar places were locked, or they opened to rooms that seemed to have shifted position. Sarah began to sob. "We're going to die here." Emily tried to stay calm, but the truth was, she felt the same. Something far beyond a simple killer was at play. The house felt alive, as if it were toying with them. And with every passing second, the fear grew. What had started as an innocent party had transformed into a desperate fight for survival. The tension in the house was unbearable. With every step, the group felt as though something or someone was watching them. The silence was now more unsettling than the screams. The walls seemed to close in, as if the house itself was slowly trying to swallow them. Emily clutched Sarah's hand tightly, trying to stay strong. They gathered once again in the living room, the only place where they still felt somewhat safe, despite it being the same room where Ryan had been just moments before his body was found upstairs. "We have to find a way out," Emily said, her voice steady, though she knew their chances of escape were dwindling with each passing minute. The front door was locked, and the windows seemed sealed. This was no longer just a party gone wrong. It was a living nightmare. They needed to act quickly. Bryce, one of the remaining guys in the group, suggested they try the attic. "If we can get to the roof, maybe we can jump." "It's not that high," he said, his voice wavering. No one had a better idea, so they went with the plan. Walking in a single file, they cautiously climbed the stairs. Each step creaked beneath their feet, the sound echoing through the dark house. The air was thick, and the smell of old wood mixed with blood was nauseating. When they reached the hallway on the second floor, everything was eerily quiet, as if the killer was patiently waiting for his next move. "I'll go first," Bryce said, trying to sound confident, though everyone knew he was terrified. He pushed open the door to the attic. The rusty hinges protested with a long, sharp creak. Inside, the darkness was almost total. Only the faint moonlight seeping through small cracks in the roof illuminated the room. Old boxes and dust-covered furniture filled the space, casting shadows that seemed to come alive with every movement of their phone flashlights. "There's nothing here," Bryce began, but he was interrupted by a heavy sound, like footsteps coming from inside the walls. Emily swallowed hard, feeling a chill run down her spine. "They're coming," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "The house is alive." "Don't be ridiculous, Sarah," Emily responded, though deep down she knew something unexplainable was happening. It's just someone trying to scare us." "It's more than that," Sarah retorted, her voice trembling. "Don't you feel it? The house. It doesn't want us to leave." At that moment, a metallic sound, like chains being dragged, echoed through the attic. Everyone froze, hearts pounding. Bryce lifted his flashlight toward the corner of the attic, where a figure began to move slowly out of the shadows. It appeared human, but something was off about the way it moved, as if its limbs weren't fully connected to its body. "Run!" Emily shouted, pulling Sarah as everyone hurried down the stairs. But as soon as they set foot back in the hallway, they heard a terrifying sound, the slamming of doors being locked, one by one. "What's happening?" Luke, one of the other guys, asked, his voice full of despair. "Someone or something is trapping us here," Emily said. "This can't be real, but we have to keep trying to get out." The group was now caught between the hope of finding an exit and the absolute fear of what awaited them. They ran toward the kitchen, where there was another door that led to the backyard. But when they arrived, they found something even more terrifying. The door was completely sealed, as if it had become part of the wall. There wasn't even a handle. Sarah started hyperventilating, and Emily tried to calm her. "Breathe, Sarah. We're going to get out of here." But deep down, Emily felt like they were being hunted. Every move, every attempt to escape seemed too predictable, as if the killer knew exactly what they would do next. And that put them at a deadly disadvantage. That's when Bryce shouted, "There!" He was pointing to a staircase leading to the basement. "If we can't get out through the front, maybe there's a secret passage underground." The idea sounded absurd, but the situation was beyond imagination. With no other choice, they descended the stairs to the basement. With each step, the air grew colder, almost freezing, and the smell of mold and decay filled their noses. The basement was large and dark, illuminated only by a single flickering light in the distance. The concrete walls were damp, and the sound of dripping water echoed throughout the space. It was as if the entire place was alive, breathing with them, waiting patiently. As they walked through the basement, something glinted in the distance. A key hung from a rusty iron hook. Emily ran to it, full of hope. "This key, maybe it's for the front door," she yelled, holding the small shiny object. But when she turned back to the group, she realized Sarah was no longer there. She had vanished, silently, without anyone noticing. Panic struck again. "Where's Sarah?" Emily asked, almost in a whisper. They began searching frantically, but all they found was a small pool of blood on the floor where she had been standing. "What's happening?" Luke yelled, punching the concrete wall. "This doesn't make sense. None of this makes sense." "We need to get out of here now," Bryce said, his voice trembling. "If we don't, we'll end up like the others." Emily agreed, fighting to keep her mind clear. She clutched the key tightly, as if it were her last hope. They made their way back to the stairs and climbed as fast as they could, not daring to look back. When they finally reached the main floor, they ran to the front door. Emily jammed the key into the lock, praying it would work. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then, with a dry click, the door opened. The feeling of relief was overwhelming, and they bolted outside, the cold night air hitting their faces. But when they looked around, they realized something horrifying. They were no longer in the same place. The yard that had once been familiar now resembled a dense, dark forest, and the gravel driveway had disappeared. The house, however, was still there, looming behind them, silent and shadowy in the night. Emily looked at Bryce and Luke, and for the first time, she realized there was no way out. The sheer terror finally hit her. The darkness around them seemed to shift, as if the night itself was alive and about to swallow them whole. Emily, Bryce, and Luke stood in shock. There was no familiar Thompson house yard anymore, only twisted trees and a thick fog that barely allowed them to see a few feet ahead. "This can't be real," Luke whispered, his voice almost inaudible, desperation growing in his eyes. We were in a normal house, in town. How did this change? It's the house. It's playing with us, Bryce said, trying to keep his composure. He glanced at Emily, who was still holding the trembling key in her hand. The key opened the door, but to where? The cold wind whipped against their faces, making the temperature drop sharply. A distant howl echoed through the forest, and Emily shivered. The sound wasn't human, but it didn't seem like an animal either. It was something deeper, more primal, as if nature itself was warning them they didn't belong here. We have to keep moving, Emily said, trying to hide her panic. We can't go back to the house. The three began walking into the darkness, their feet sinking into the damp earth covered in dead leaves. Every step was a battle against the growing fear, the unsettling silence, and the constant feeling of being watched. The heavy air made it hard to breathe, as if they were slowly being suffocated by unseen forces. After a few minutes, Bryce suddenly stopped. He looked around, frowning, as if something was wrong. Wait, we've been here before. What do you mean? Emily looked around, and the realization hit her like a blow. The twisted tree that stood out to her left, with a large scar on its trunk, was unmistakable. They were walking in circles. This can't be happening, said Luke, staring at the ground. We're trapped. No matter what we do, we end up in the same place. The group's despair intensified. They couldn't go back to the house, but they also couldn't escape the forest, which seemed to close in around them. Emily felt panic rise in her throat, her mind racing for answers. Someone is controlling this. It can't be a coincidence. Bryce looked around once more and then, with a trembling voice, said, Maybe it's the house itself. Maybe. We never really left. Emily stared at him, trying to process what he was suggesting. Could it be possible? Was everything they were experiencing part of some kind of hallucination, or had the house somehow swallowed them? All they knew was that something beyond their understanding was at play, something that transcended reality. The silence was broken by a distant sound, like leaves being crushed underfoot. They froze, listening intently. The sound was approaching quickly, and it was impossible to ignore the fact that it wasn't the rustling of an ordinary animal. Do we run? Asked Luke, eyes wide. Emily shook her head. It won't matter. It'll catch us. But Bryce didn't wait. He bolted through the forest, with Luke right behind him. Emily hesitated for a second, but her survival instinct forced her to follow. They ran in desperation, stumbling over roots and branches that seemed to grow on purpose to trip them. The sound of something pursuing them grew louder, the rustling of leaves now clearly accompanied by heavy, ragged breathing. Suddenly, a piercing scream echoed through the night. Emily stopped, her heart pounding frantically. Bryce had fallen. She found him curled up on the ground, his face pale and his eyes wide with terror. Bryce! She knelt beside him, shaking him. Get up! We need to keep moving. But he couldn't move. Something invisible seemed to be holding him to the ground. His lips moved, but no words came out. Luke ran back, grabbing Emily by the arm. We have to go now, he shouted, pointing at the shadow quickly advancing between the trees. With no choice, Emily and Luke ran again, leaving Bryce behind. But the scream he let out, a sound of pure terror and pain, followed them through the night. He's gone, said Luke, breathless, as they stopped beside a large rock. What was that? Emily didn't answer. She was terrified, but she knew that if they stopped to think, they'd be next. All that mattered now was survival. As they tried to catch their breath, Emily noticed something strange. Across the clearing where they had stopped, a faint glow appeared among the trees. It looked like a light, soft and flickering, like a candle. Do you see that? She asked, pointing. Luke nodded, unsure of what to think. What is that? Another trap. I don't know, but it's the only different thing we've seen since we left the house. With no better options, The two cautiously walked toward the light. As they got closer, they realized that the source of the glow was a small cabin, hidden in the forest. A cabin that, as far as they knew, hadn't been there before. "Someone's in there," whispered Emily, her heart racing. The cabin door was slightly ajar, and the light was coming from an old lantern sitting on a wooden table in the center of the room. The walls were covered in strange symbols, carved into the wood. Symbols Emily didn't recognize, but just looking at them made her stomach churn. At the back of the cabin, a tall, ancient mirror reflected the room's interior. But what caught her attention most was what was reflected in it. Bryce, standing, staring directly at her. His face was pale, and his body seemed rigid, as if frozen in time. "Bryce." Emily stepped forward, confused and terrified. "That's not him," Luke murmured, backing away. It's a trap." Emily felt a deep chill when she realized the figure in the mirror wasn't actually standing there in the room. It was as if it was trapped inside the mirror, watching them from the other side. Bryce didn't move, but his eyes pleaded for something. Maybe help, or maybe for the end of his suffering. Before they could react, the cabin door slammed shut with a bang, and the lantern flickered. The mirror suddenly began to crack, as if some invisible pressure was building inside it. "They're trapping us, like they did with Bryce," Emily said, her voice breaking. She ran to the door, trying to force it open, but something pushed her back. The air in the cabin became suffocating, and the symbols on the walls seemed to shift, spinning and changing as the mirror began to glow intensely. Luke was in shock, unable to speak, his eyes fixed on the crack spreading across the mirror's glass. Suddenly, a pale, deformed hand burst through the crack, followed by a twisted body, no longer Bryce but something distorted and monstrous. Emily screamed, backing away as the thing emerged from the mirror. Emily backed up until her back hit the wall of the cabin, her heart racing uncontrollably and her breath coming in ragged gasps from the sheer terror she felt. What had emerged from the mirror was something distorted, a grotesque parody of Bryce, as if he had been torn apart and put back together wrong. His skin was pale, his eyes lifeless, but there was a malevolent gleam in his expression, something inhuman. Luke stood frozen, paralyzed by the horror. When the Bryce moved forward, his feet made no sound, as if he were floating, approaching Luke with an intent that emanated an aura of death. Emily wanted to scream, but no sound came out. She wanted to run, but her feet felt glued to the floor. Everything in her mind screamed for her to move, but fear held her in place more firmly than any chain. As the creature extended its hand toward Luke, its long, twisted fingers gripped his arm tightly. A horrible scream ripped from Luke's throat, and Emily finally managed to move. She ran toward him, trying to push the creature away, but its strength was supernatural, and Emily was easily thrown backward. "No, no, Luke!" Emily screamed, watching the life drain from her friend's eyes as the creature pulled his soul into its deformed body. In a matter of seconds, all that was left of Luke was an empty shell, collapsing to the ground like a lifeless doll. The creature turned its vacant gaze to Emily, as if studying her, like a predator savoring its prey before delivering the final blow. The room around her began to tremble. The cabin's walls seemed to pulse, the carved symbols on the wood glowing bright red, as if the cabin itself were alive, as if it were a portal to a far worse place. But then, something unexpected happened. The mirror, now completely shattered, began to glow intensely once more. Amidst the chaos, a figure started to emerge from the shards. To Emily's shock, it was Sarah. However, unlike Bryce and Luke, Sarah didn't appear deformed or possessed. She looked serious, her skin waxy pale, but there was strength in her eyes. "Sarah," Emily whispered, unable to believe what she was seeing. "Emily," Sarah's voice sounded distant, almost like an echo, "there's no going back. I tried to fight it, but the house, it's more than a prison. It's an entity. It feeds on us. But there's still a chance to escape." Emily felt a glimmer of hope, though she knew this could be another trap. "How?" she asked, her voice shaky, as the creature that was once Bryce began advancing again. "You need to destroy the house. End the cycle." Sarah's voice grew clearer now, and she looked directly into Emily's eyes. "It's the heart of everything. As long as the house exists, it will continue to drain the life of anyone who enters." Emily frantically looked around, searching for something she could use to destroy the place. The cabin shook more with every passing second, and the creature was getting closer. Then she saw it, on the table next to the mirror, a small, old oil lantern. Without thinking twice, she grabbed it, pouring the oil over the floorboards and the carved walls. "If I die, you must keep going," Sarah whispered, her figure beginning to fade slowly, as if being pulled back to where she had come from. "Destroy the house, Emily, before it destroys you." With Sarah's last words echoing in her mind, Emily lit the lantern and tossed the flaming wick onto the spilled oil. The flames erupted quickly, consuming the cabin's floor. The heat was unbearable, but Emily refused to back down. The creature let out one final, horrible roar before vanishing into the flames, as if it had been consumed by the house itself. Emily ran to the door, kicking it with all her strength, but it wouldn't budge. The walls around her began to close in, the fire growing and smoke filling the air. Emily coughed, her eyes watering, her mind spinning, sensing that the house was determined to take her too. She pounded on the door with all her might, screaming in pure desperation. Then, suddenly, the door burst outward, throwing her to the ground outside. Emily rolled onto the grass, coughing and gasping for fresh air, her face smeared with soot, but alive. When she looked back, the cabin was engulfed in flames, the walls collapsing under the weight of the fire. But beyond the cabin, the Thompson house itself was also burning, as if the flames had somehow spread there. Emily stood up shakily, watching as both structures crumbled into a pile of ashes, the crackling of the fire the only sound she could hear. It was over, or so she thought. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Emily heard a faint whisper in the distance, coming from the ruins. A familiar sound, but one that filled her with unbearable cold. "Emily!" She turned, her eyes wide. Sarah's voice was still there, distant but present. "You think it's over, but the house never dies." Emily took a step back, fear gripping her body once more. And then she saw it, among the ashes, the outline of something that should have been destroyed, the mirror's frame, intact. The cycle wasn't over yet.